A dangerous confrontation. The sun hung low in the crisp autumn sky, casting long golden shadows across the bustling city of Lake Ridge. Marcus Bradley, a seasoned federal prosecutor, adjusted his tie as he stepped out of the courthouse. At 39 years old, Marcus had built a reputation as a relentless advocate for justice, a man who refused to back down even when facing insurmountable odds. His latest case, however, was personal in a way that no other had been. For nearly 2 years, Marcus had been leading an investigation into systemic misconduct within the Lake Ridge Police Department. The evidence was damning, data showing a staggering racial disparity in traffic stops, countless first-hand accounts of racial profiling, and shocking whistleblower testimonies from within the department. The investigation had consumed his life, leaving him sleepless and isolated, but Marcus knew the stakes. If he could expose the rot within the system, he could help dismantle a culture of discrimination that had persisted for decades. "Mr. Bradley, don't forget about tomorrow's interview with CNN," called out Claire, his assistant, jogging to catch up with him. She was clutching a tablet, her face a mix of excitement and concern. "They're going to press hard for specifics on the case." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm ready," he said firmly. "We need the public's attention on this. The truth has to come out." Claire hesitated, her brows furrowed. "Just be careful, Marcus. You've made enemies. People are talking. You're not exactly popular in certain circles." Marcus offered her a reassuring smile, though his mind was already elsewhere. He knew the risks. As a black man holding those in power accountable, he had faced threats before. But he had no intention of backing down. Later that evening, seeking solace from the day's pressures, Marcus decided to take a walk through Maplewood Park, a tranquil expanse of trees and winding paths not far from his home. The park had always been his refuge, a place to clear his head and strategize. The crisp air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the soft crunch of his shoes against the path provided a comforting rhythm. As he strolled deeper into the park, the light of day began to fade, painting the sky in hues of amber and lavender. Marcus's thoughts drifted to the case, the long hours spent poring over evidence, the courageous whistleblowers who had risked everything to come forward. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice the squad car pulling up until its headlights cut through the encroaching twilight. The vehicle came to a stop a few yards away, and 2 officers stepped out. Marcus's instincts, honed from years in the courtroom, immediately sensed trouble. The taller of the 2, Officer Reynolds, placed a hand on his holster as he approached. His partner, Officer Blake, trailed behind, his expression unreadable. "Evening," Reynolds said, his tone sharp and devoid of warmth. "What are you doing here?" Marcus remained calm, though his pulse quickened. "Just taking a walk," he replied evenly. "Is there a problem, officers?" Reynolds's eyes narrowed. "You look out of place," he said bluntly. "We've had reports of a suspicious person in the area." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "Suspicious? For walking in a public park?" Reynolds's jaw tightened. "Don't get smart with me. Let's see some ID." Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "Am I being detained?" he asked. "If not, I'd like to continue my walk." The question seemed to ignite something in Reynolds. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed Marcus's arm. "Stop resisting," he barked, though Marcus had made no such move. The officer's grip was rough, his demeanor aggressive. "I'm not resisting," Marcus said firmly, though his voice carried an edge now. Before he could say more, Blake joined in, forcing Marcus to the ground. The cold, damp pavement pressed against his cheek as Reynolds twisted his arm behind his back. A small crowd had begun to gather, their murmurs growing louder as the scene unfolded. "Hey, he's not doing anything wrong," shouted a woman, her phone raised to record the encounter. "Leave him alone," called out another voice, a man stepping closer but hesitant to intervene physically. Marcus remained silent as they cuffed him and hauled him to his feet. His mind raced, calculating his next moves. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the very system he was fighting to expose. As they shoved him into the back of the squad car, Marcus's face remained stoic, though inside, a fire burned. The ride to the station was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. When they arrived, Marcus was led into a sterile interrogation room and seated in a cold metal chair. Reynolds and Blake stood over him, their postures oozing arrogance. "Let's make this simple," Reynolds said, leaning in close. "Why were you skulking around that park? Looking for trouble?" Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I told you. I was taking a walk." Reynolds sneered. "You expect us to believe that?" Marcus remained silent, his expression giving nothing away. He knew they hadn't run his ID yet. They hadn't bothered. They saw a black man in a park after dark and made their assumptions. But he also knew it was only a matter of time before they realized who he was. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew thick. Blake left briefly, likely to check Marcus's identification. When he returned, his face had lost its smugness. He whispered something to Reynolds, whose expression shifted from arrogance to disbelief. "You're kidding," Reynolds muttered. Blake shook his head, his eyes darting nervously to Marcus. Reynolds straightened, his tone now forced and controlled. "Mr. Bradley, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Marcus stood, smoothing his jacket with deliberate precision. "A misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Is that what we're calling it?" Neither officer met his gaze. Marcus stepped closer, his presence commanding. "You'll be hearing from me," he said simply before walking out of the room. As he exited the station, the cold night air hit him like a wave. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The humiliation and anger simmered beneath the surface, but Marcus knew he couldn't afford to let it consume him. This was bigger than his personal experience. This was about every person who had ever been unjustly targeted, every community that had suffered under the weight of systemic bias. By the time he reached his car, Marcus had already made up his mind. This incident would not be swept under the rug. It would be the catalyst that propelled his case into the national spotlight. And when the world saw the truth, there would be no turning back. The fight for justice was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The spark of outrage. The following morning, the Lake Ridge Police Department was in an uproar. Overnight, a video of Marcus's arrest had gone viral. Recorded by one of the bystanders in the park, the footage showed Marcus calmly questioning the officers, the unwarranted aggression, and his forced takedown. The headline across social media platforms read, "Federal Prosecutor Targeted in Racially Charged Arrest by Local Police." Inside the station, Officer Reynolds and Officer Blake sat in a cramped office, their expressions dark as they reviewed the fallout. The video had gained traction faster than they could have anticipated. Thousands of comments flooded in, demanding justice and accountability. Calls to the precinct had surged, with angry citizens demanding explanations. Chief Hawkins, the gruff, no-nonsense leader of the department, was pacing back and forth, his face a storm cloud of frustration. "You two," he barked, pointing at Reynolds and Blake. "Do you have any idea who that man is? Do you have any idea what kind of hellstorm you've brought on us?" Reynolds's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We thought he was just another guy causing trouble," Reynolds finally muttered. "How were we supposed to know he was him?" Hawkins slammed a file onto the desk in front of them. "You didn't think. That's the problem. You profile someone walking in a public park, escalate the situation, and now we're under national scrutiny. Congratulations. What do we do now, Chief?" Blake asked hesitantly. Hawkins glared at him. "We're not doing anything. You're both suspended until further notice." And God help us if Marcus Bradley decides to press charges. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his living room, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. Claire had already called him 3 times that morning, her voice brimming with urgency. Marcus, this is everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, even local outlets are covering it. This is huge. I know, Marcus replied, his tone measured but heavy. He stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street in front of his house. But this isn't about me. This is about the bigger picture. You need to make a statement, Claire urged. The public is rallying behind you, but they need to hear from you. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. He'd spent the better part of the night replaying the incident in his mind. The humiliation, the fury, the sheer audacity of the officers. But his training and experience had taught him one thing: emotional reactions rarely achieve justice. He needed to be strategic. Schedule the CNN interview for tonight, he said finally. We'll use this momentum to bring attention to the case against the department. Claire's voice lit up. Got it. I'll make the arrangements. And Marcus? Yeah. Stay safe. Things are going to get messy. By the time Marcus arrived at the CNN studio that evening, the story had become a national talking point. Protesters had gathered outside the Lake Ridge Police Department, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus," and "End Police Racism." The footage of the arrest was being dissected by analysts and commentators, each one pointing to the systemic issues it highlighted. Marcus adjusted his tie as he sat across from the host, a sharp-eyed woman named Angela Martinez. The studio lights were hot, and the hum of the cameras created a low buzz in the background. "Mr. Bradley," Angela began, "thank you for joining us tonight." "Thank you for having me," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "Let's get straight to it," Angela said, leaning forward slightly. "The video of your arrest has sparked outrage across the country. Can you walk us through what happened?" Marcus took a moment to compose his thoughts. "I was taking a walk in a public park, something I've done countless times. 2 officers approached me, accused me of being suspicious, and when I asserted my rights, they escalated the situation. I was detained without cause and treated with unnecessary force." "And when they discovered your identity?" Angela prompted. Marcus's expression hardened. Their demeanor shifted instantly. "But the issue isn't who I am. The issue is that this happens to people who don't have the privilege of a platform or the resources to fight back. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much larger problem." Angela nodded, her face serious. "Your investigation into the Lake Ridge Police Department, does this incident strengthen your resolve?" "Absolutely," Marcus said, his voice firm. "The evidence we've gathered shows a pattern of racial profiling, excessive use of force, and systemic discrimination. This incident is just further proof of what we've been saying all along. Change is long overdue." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus outlining the scope of his investigation and the steps needed to reform the system. By the time it aired, social media was ablaze with support. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #ReformLakeRidgePD were trending, and public figures from politicians to celebrities were weighing in. Back at the Lake Ridge Police Department, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Hawkins watched the interview from his office, his face a mask of grim determination. He knew the department was on the verge of a full-blown crisis. The mayor had already called, demanding answers and threatening to bring in external oversight. Hawkins leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent decades in law enforcement, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. The department's reputation was in tatters, and the officers involved were liabilities. If they didn't act quickly, the fallout could be catastrophic. "Get me Reynolds and Blake," he barked into the intercom. "Now." As the week went on, the protests grew larger. People from all walks of life joined in, their voices united in a call for justice. Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight, a reluctant symbol of the fight against systemic racism. But he didn't let the attention distract him. Behind the scenes, he continued to build his case, working tirelessly with his team to ensure that the department would be held accountable. One evening, as he reviewed documents in his home office, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mr. Bradley," a deep voice said. "This is Chief Hawkins. We need to talk." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm listening." There was a pause on the other end. "I want to meet. Off the record. Just you and me." Marcus's mind raced. What could Hawkins possibly want? Was this a trap, an attempt to intimidate him? Or was it something else? "Why should I agree to that?" Marcus asked, his voice wary. "Because," Hawkins said, his tone heavy with resignation, "I think we're on the same side. And I have information you need." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. He didn't trust Hawkins, but the possibility of gaining valuable intel was too important to ignore. "Fine," he said finally. "Name the time and place." As he hung up, Marcus felt a knot of tension settle in his chest. The fight was escalating, and the stakes were higher than ever. But one thing was certain, he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Meeting in the shadows. The next evening, Marcus drove to the location Chief Hawkins had specified. It was an old diner on the outskirts of town, a relic from another era with faded neon lights that buzzed faintly against the twilight. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few scattered vehicles, their owners likely regulars. Marcus parked his car in the far corner and sat for a moment, his fingers drumming the steering wheel as he considered his next move. Hawkins had insisted the meeting be off the record, but Marcus was no fool. He had taken precautions. His phone was recording, discreetly tucked into his jacket pocket, and Claire knew his location. If anything went wrong, the world would know. As he stepped inside, the scent of fried food and stale coffee greeted him. Hawkins was already there, sitting in a booth at the back, his wide frame hunched over a cup of coffee. His uniform was absent, replaced by a plain button-up shirt and slacks, making him look more like a weary retiree than the chief of police. When he saw Marcus, he gestured for him to sit. "Thanks for coming," Hawkins said gruffly, his voice low. "I wasn't sure you would." Marcus slid into the booth across from him, his expression unreadable. "I'm here. Let's get to it." Hawkins sighed, running a hand over his face. For a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "You've got to understand," he began, "this department, it wasn't always like this. When I started, we were about community policing, building trust. But somewhere along the way, things changed." "Changed how?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp. Hawkins hesitated, his gaze dropping to his coffee. The pressure to get results, to keep crime stats down, it led to cutting corners. And when you cut corners, the wrong kind of people thrive. Officers like Reynolds and Blake, they don't see people. They see threats. And they think force is the only language anyone understands. And you let it happen, Marcus said, his voice edged with anger. "You're the chief. You set the tone." Hawkins's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent sleepless nights wondering where I went wrong? But this isn't just about me. It's bigger than me, bigger than this department." Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms. "Then why are we here, Chief? What do you want from me?" Hawkins reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, placing it on the table between them. "This," he said quietly, "is everything you need to bring the system down. Internal memos, emails, whistleblower reports I've been collecting. It's all there." Marcus stared at the drive, skepticism etched into his features. "Why now? Why not clean house yourself?" "Because I can't," Hawkins admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The rot runs too deep. If I try to fix it from the inside, they'll bury me, and the evidence. But you can do what I can't. You can shine a light on this. The weight of Hawkins's words hung in the air. Marcus studied the man before him, searching for any hint of deceit. He saw none. Just a tired, broken man trying to atone for his failures. Finally, Marcus reached out and took the drive. If this is legit, it'll change everything, he said. But make no mistake, Chief. If I find out you're trying to cover your own ass, I'll take you down with the rest of them. Hawkins nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Fair enough. That night, back in his home office, Marcus plugged the drive into his laptop. Claire was on a video call, her face tense as she watched him navigate the files. What he found was staggering. Claire, this is a goldmine, Marcus said, his voice a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. There are reports of officers falsifying evidence, targeting specific neighborhoods, even internal memos discussing quotas for arrests. Claire leaned closer to her screen. This is systemic corruption, Marcus. This isn't just a few bad apples. It's the whole orchard. Marcus's jaw tightened as he clicked through the files. One folder, labeled High Priority, caught his attention. Inside were detailed accounts from officers who had tried to speak out, only to be silenced through demotions or threats. They've been suppressing whistleblowers, Marcus said, his anger simmering beneath the surface. This isn't incompetence. This is deliberate. What's the next move? Claire asked, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were uncovering. Marcus leaned back, his mind racing. We build the case. We go public, but not just with accusations. We present irrefutable evidence. We make it so they can't sweep this under the rug. And Hawkins? Claire asked. Marcus hesitated. For now, we keep his involvement quiet. If he's genuine, he's a valuable ally. If not, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. Marcus and his team worked around the clock, compiling the evidence into a comprehensive report. Claire reached out to trusted journalists, laying the groundwork for a coordinated release. Meanwhile, the protests outside the Lake Ridge Police Department showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, they were growing louder, more determined. One evening, as Marcus prepared for a meeting with his legal team, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number, watch your back. Some people don't want the truth to come out. Marcus stared at the message, his pulse quickening. He had expected pushback, even threats, but this felt different. He forwarded the message to Claire and his security consultant, then deleted it. Whoever had sent it wouldn't intimidate him. If anything, it only strengthened his resolve. The day of the press conference arrived, and the air was electric with anticipation. Reporters from every major outlet crowded into the conference room, their cameras trained on the podium where Marcus would soon speak. Outside, protesters cheered and chanted, their voices a powerful backdrop to the unfolding drama. As Marcus stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the room. He placed the stack of evidence on the lectern, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. For too long, he began, his voice strong and unwavering, the people of Lake Ridge have suffered under a system that prioritizes power over justice. Today, that changes. He outlined the findings, each revelation more damning than the last. By the time he finished, the room was buzzing with shock and outrage. Questions flew at him from all directions, but Marcus held his ground, answering each one with precision and clarity. When the conference ended, Marcus felt a surge of relief. The truth was out. The fight wasn't over, but this was a turning point. As he walked to his car, flanked by Claire and his security team, he couldn't help but think of Hawkins. The chief had taken a risk by coming forward, and now, the weight of his decisions would become clear. Whether Hawkins would be remembered as a hero or a coward was yet to be seen. But one thing was certain, Marcus wouldn't stop until justice was served. Retaliation and resolve. The fallout from Marcus's press conference was immediate and explosive. News outlets across the country replayed his revelations in a near-constant loop, dissecting every detail of the evidence he presented. Protesters swelled in number outside the Lake Ridge Police Department, their chants growing louder and more forceful with each passing hour. Social media buzzed with calls for accountability, and hashtags like #JusticeForLakeRidge and #SystemicChange now dominated the digital landscape. But as the truth spread, so did the backlash. Marcus woke up the next morning to find his inbox flooded with hate mail. Threatening messages poured into his phone, and his home address was doxed online, sparking a wave of fear among his neighbors. The once quiet street he lived on was now patrolled by police cars, ironically, from the very department he was fighting to reform. Claire's voice crackled through the speakerphone as Marcus sat at his dining table, staring at a stack of legal briefs. "This isn't just a reaction," she said, her tone urgent. "It's coordinated. Someone's trying to silence you." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice calm but strained. He hadn't slept more than a few hours since the press conference. "But we're not backing down. The more they push, the more obvious it becomes that we're on the right track." "Still, you need to be careful," Claire warned. "We don't know who's behind this or how far they're willing to go." Marcus nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I've already increased security," he said. "Let's stay focused on the case. We've got momentum, and we're not losing it." Meanwhile, inside the Lake Ridge Police Department, chaos reigned. Chief Hawkins's office was a war zone of papers, phone calls, and emergency meetings. The department was under siege from all sides: politicians, activists, journalists, and even some of their own officers who had decided to speak out. "We need a statement," one of the department's PR officers insisted, her voice rising above the din, "something that shows we're cooperating with the investigation." Hawkins slammed his hands on his desk, silencing the room. "We're not issuing a damn thing until I say so," he growled. His gaze swept over the group, settling on Reynolds and Blake, who stood near the back of the room, their faces pale and drawn. "And as for you two," he continued, his tone venomous, "pray that your names don't come up in the next round of reports." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, but Blake's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Chief, maybe you should." "Don't," Hawkins snapped, cutting him off. "Not another word." The room fell silent as the weight of his authority settled over them. Hawkins knew his department was crumbling, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. 2 nights later, as Marcus returned home from a late meeting, he noticed something off. The street was unusually quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. He parked his car and stepped out, his eyes scanning the shadows. The sound of glass shattering broke the silence, and Marcus's head whipped toward his house. Someone had thrown a brick through his front window, and as he approached, he saw the message scrawled across the brick in red paint, "drop the case or pay the price." Marcus's chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He pulled out his phone and called the police, knowing full well the irony of the situation. As he waited for them to arrive, he snapped photos of the damage, his mind racing. By the time the officers showed up, Marcus had already decided his next move. He wasn't going to let intimidation derail his mission. If anything, the attack only solidified his resolve. The next morning, Marcus called a meeting with his legal team and key allies. They gathered in a conference room at his law firm, the air thick with determination. "They're scared," Marcus began, addressing the group. "And they should be. We have the truth on our side, and they know it. But we're not going to let fear dictate our actions." Claire nodded, her expression resolute. "We need to double down. More evidence, more witnesses. If they want to play dirty, we'll play smart." One of the attorneys, a wiry man named Peter, spoke up. "We've got new whistleblowers coming forward every day. But we need to ensure their safety. The threats aren't just aimed at you, Marcus. They're targeting anyone who's helping us." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we'll protect them. Hire private security if we have to. Whatever it takes." As the meeting continued, they laid out their next steps: a public forum to give whistleblowers a platform, a push for federal oversight of the Lake Ridge Police Department, and an appeal to the Department of Justice to intervene. Every move was calculated, designed to apply maximum pressure on the corrupt system they were fighting. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his office, reviewing the latest batch of documents. The USB drive from Hawkins had proven invaluable, but it was only the beginning. The deeper they dug, the more corruption they uncovered. It was like peeling back the layers of an onion, each one revealing something more rotten beneath. As he worked, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert: anonymous source leaks audio recording from Lake Ridge Police Department. Marcus clicked on the link, his heart pounding. The recording was damning. It featured a conversation between two high-ranking officers, openly discussing ways to suppress evidence and intimidate witnesses. The voices were unmistakable, and the implications were clear: the corruption went all the way to the top. Claire called moments later, her voice filled with urgency. "Marcus, have you heard it?" "I'm listening to it now," he replied. "This changes everything." "It's already spreading like wildfire," Claire said. "We need to act fast. This could be the final nail in their coffin." Marcus nodded, a sense of determination washing over him. "Schedule another press conference. Tomorrow. We're not holding back anymore." The next day, Marcus stood once again at the podium, the eyes of the nation upon him. He played the recording for the room, the voices echoing through the speakers like a chilling reminder of the system's failures. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral, a mix of gasps and angry murmurs. "This is the reality we're fighting," Marcus said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "This is why we can't stop. Not until every officer involved is held accountable and every victim of their corruption sees justice." As he spoke, Marcus felt the weight of the moment. The threats, the intimidation, the sleepless nights, it was all worth it. The tide was turning, and there was no going back. When the press conference ended, Marcus walked out into the sunlight, the cheers of the protesters ringing in his ears. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. The fight wasn't over, but they were winning. And that was enough to keep him going. A tipping point. The momentum of Marcus's fight for justice had reached a fever pitch. The recording of Lake Ridge's high-ranking officers conspiring to suppress evidence had galvanized the nation. Calls for immediate reform erupted from every corner of the country, and federal oversight of the police department was now a real possibility. But with the stakes higher than ever, the backlash became more ferocious. As Marcus drove back to his office the evening after the press conference, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced at his rearview mirror and noticed a black sedan trailing him, its headlights a constant presence in the distance. He turned down a side street, his heart pounding. The car followed. Marcus's instincts kicked in, and he made another quick turn, hoping to lose his shadow. When the sedan didn't reappear, he pulled into a well-lit gas station, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He sat for a moment, steadying his breathing. This wasn't paranoia. It was a warning. And he wasn't about to ignore it. Back at his office, Claire was waiting for him, her face etched with worry. "Marcus, I just got off the phone with Peter," she said, referring to one of their attorneys. "The DOJ is considering stepping in, but they're demanding even more concrete evidence. We're close, but we're not there yet." Marcus sat down at his desk, his mind racing. "What about the whistleblowers? Have we gotten any more testimonies?" Claire hesitated. We lost one. Officer Jenkins backed out. He says he's getting threats and can't risk his family's safety. Marcus's jaw tightened. He couldn't blame Jenkins. The fear was real, and not everyone was willing to put their lives on the line. But it was a setback, and they couldn't afford too many of those. What about Chief Hawkins? Marcus asked. Has he followed through on his promise to get us more names? Claire nodded. He's working on it, but he's walking a tightrope. The department is starting to suspect he's helping us. If they find out for sure, it'll be over for him. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. We need more pressure. If the DOJ wants undeniable proof, then we'll give it to them. But that means taking risks. Claire raised an eyebrow. What kind of risks? Marcus leaned forward, his eyes sharp. We go directly to the source. We find someone on the inside who's willing to expose the department's secrets, no matter the cost. The next day, Marcus met with Hawkins in a secluded park just outside the city. The chief looked more haggard than ever, his shoulders slumped and his eyes bloodshot. You've put me in a hell of a position, Marcus, Hawkins said, his voice low. I'm getting pressure from both sides. My officers think I've turned against them, and the public, well, you've seen the protests. You made your choice when you handed me that drive, Marcus replied. And you knew what it would cost. Now we need more. Names, Hawkins. We need the people who are pulling the strings. Hawkins hesitated, his gaze darting around the park as if he expected someone to jump out of the bushes. There's someone, he admitted. Lieutenant Carla Monroe. She's been in the department for 20 years, and she's seen it all. If anyone knows where the bodies are buried, it's her. Can she be trusted? Marcus asked. Hawkins's expression darkened. I don't know. But if you can convince her, she could blow this thing wide open. That evening, Marcus reached out to Lieutenant Monroe. She agreed to meet, but her conditions were clear, it had to be off the record, and no one could know. The meeting took place in a dimly lit coffee shop far from the city center. Monroe arrived wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, her posture stiff with tension. I don't know why I'm here, she said as she sat across from Marcus. Do you have any idea what you're asking me to do? I do, Marcus replied. But you've seen what's happening. The corruption, the abuse. If you stay silent, it continues. If you speak up, you could help end it. Monroe's jaw tightened. You think it's that simple? I've got a family. A life. If I go against the department, I lose everything. And what about the people who have already lost everything? Marcus countered. The families torn apart, the lives destroyed. You have the power to make a difference, Lieutenant. Don't let fear stop you. For a long moment, Monroe said nothing. Then she sighed, her shoulders sagging. I'll think about it, she said finally. But no promises. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Monroe eventually agreed to provide information, but she insisted on complete anonymity. She handed over a treasure trove of documents, emails, internal memos, even audio recordings, that painted a damning picture of the department's inner workings. It was the break Marcus had been waiting for. But the stakes were higher than ever. As the evidence mounted, so did the threats. Marcus's security team intercepted a suspicious package left on his doorstep, and his car was vandalized outside his office. The message was clear: back off or face the consequences. Marcus refused to back down. Instead, he doubled his efforts, working late into the night to compile the evidence into an airtight case. Claire and the rest of his team matched his determination, their exhaustion tempered by the knowledge that they were on the verge of something monumental. The day the case was submitted to the Department of Justice, Marcus stood in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The weight of the fight pressed down on him, but so did the resolve to see it through. Claire entered, holding a cup of coffee. It's done, she said. The DOJ has everything. Now we wait. Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. We're not done yet, he said. Not until the system changes. Not until justice is served. Claire smiled faintly. You're relentless, you know that. Marcus turned to her, a fire burning in his eyes. Someone has to be. Justice unleashed. The atmosphere inside the Lake Ridge courthouse was electric. Crowds gathered outside, their voices raised in chants demanding accountability. Signs waved above the sea of protesters, emblazoned with slogans like "End Corruption Now" and "Justice for All." For Marcus, standing in the center of it all, the day marked the culmination of months of relentless effort. Today, the Department of Justice would decide whether to intervene in the Lake Ridge Police Department. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Federal investigators had flown in from Washington, D.C., flanked by an entourage of attorneys and reporters. At the heart of the proceedings stood Marcus, presenting the damning evidence he and his team had painstakingly compiled. Every word he spoke was backed by hard proof, internal memos, recorded conversations, whistleblower accounts, and data that painted a grim picture of systemic racism and corruption. For years, Marcus said, his voice steady but charged with emotion, this department has operated with impunity, targeting the most vulnerable members of our community. The evidence we've uncovered is not just an indictment of the officers involved but of the culture that allowed such abuses to flourish. He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, save for the scratching of pens on notepads. But this isn't just about Lake Ridge, he continued. This is a reflection of a larger issue, one that demands not just accountability but systemic change. The people of Lake Ridge deserve better. And today, we have the opportunity to ensure that they get it. As he finished, Marcus looked up at the panel of DOJ officials. Their expressions were unreadable, but he could sense the weight of his words. Now, all he could do was wait. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic. Protesters clashed with counter-demonstrators who had shown up in support of the police department. The tension boiled over when a small group began hurling insults and, eventually, objects at the crowd demanding justice. Police officers were deployed to separate the two groups, but their presence only added to the volatility. From the courthouse steps, Marcus watched the scene unfold, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Claire stood beside him, her phone buzzing with updates from their legal team. It's getting ugly out there, she said, glancing at the skirmish below. We need to be prepared for backlash no matter what the DOJ decides. Marcus nodded, his jaw set. Let them push back. We've come too far to stop now. Later that afternoon, the DOJ's decision was announced. The courtroom filled once again, the air thick with anticipation. The lead investigator, a stern woman with sharp eyes named Lisa Carter, rose to deliver the verdict. After thorough review of the evidence presented, she began, the Department of Justice has determined that there is sufficient cause to initiate a full federal investigation into the Lake Ridge Police Department. Effective immediately, a federal oversight committee will be established to monitor all operations within the department. Furthermore, officers implicated in the evidence provided will be placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The room erupted. Some cheered, while others shouted in anger. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, and Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. But as the noise subsided, Lisa Carter's gaze settled on him. Mr. Bradley, she said, this victory is just the beginning. The road ahead will be long, and the resistance will be fierce. Are you prepared to see this through? Marcus stood, meeting her gaze with unwavering determination. I've been prepared since the day this fight began, he said. And I'm not stopping until justice is served. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The federal investigation dominated headlines, and Marcus found himself thrust into the national spotlight. His phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, offers to speak at conferences, and messages of support from across the country. But not all the attention was positive. One morning, as Marcus prepared for a live television interview, Claire burst into his office, her face pale. "We have a problem," she said, holding up her phone. "Someone leaked your home address. It's all over social media." Marcus's stomach dropped. "What about security?" he asked. "They're already stationed outside your house," Claire replied. "But this isn't just about you. Your neighbors are worried, and the media's already camped out on your street." Marcus rubbed his temples, frustration mounting. "This is their play," he said. "Intimidation. They want me to back off." "Are you?" Claire asked, her voice softer now. He looked at her, his expression firm. "Not a chance." As the weeks turned into months, the federal investigation uncovered even more damning evidence. Several high-ranking officers were arrested, and Chief Hawkins resigned under mounting pressure. Though he had initially helped Marcus, it became clear that his failures as a leader had contributed to the department's corruption. His departure was met with mixed reactions, but Marcus knew it was a necessary step toward meaningful reform. Lieutenant Carla Monroe, the whistleblower who had provided critical evidence, became a reluctant hero. Though she had feared for her safety, the overwhelming public support gave her the courage to continue speaking out. She and Marcus developed a mutual respect, their shared determination to expose the truth forging a bond that transcended their initial mistrust. One evening, as Marcus walked through the now quiet streets of Lake Ridge, he reflected on how far they had come. The protests had dwindled, replaced by community meetings aimed at rebuilding trust between the police and the people they served. It was a small but significant step forward. As he passed the park where his journey had begun, Marcus paused. The memories of that night, the confrontation, the humiliation, the rage, flooded back. But now, those memories were tempered by the knowledge that change was possible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was happening. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Claire. "Congrats. DOJ just announced nationwide police reform recommendations inspired by our case. We did it." Marcus smiled, a sense of quiet triumph filling him. The fight wasn't over, but they had achieved something monumental. And as long as there was injustice to confront, Marcus knew he would be ready.